The session's going to run for an hour, and after that there is an opportunity, if you would like to extend discussion, to ask more questions, to come with more stories. All of this is really welcome. We're going to stay open for up to half an hour after the end of the session for anybody who would like to stay on and carry on chatting, and we're really encouraging you to do that if you would like to. We've called the subtitle of this session is Danger and Opportunity. And I think we are on the verge, aren't we now, of the next 4 days of a huge series of demonstrations in London, which underline the urgency in all our minds about this human crisis, this local crisis, this global crisis that we're all facing. I know that many people from Birmingham are going. Bishop Anne commends this to us in her recent notes. I think over this winter, we've all felt, haven't we, the weight of the overlapping crises, including the ones which have led to the awful immediate sense of threat to millions of our fellow citizens in churches, in our communities, over fuel and food poverty. And churches are seeking all over the place to respond creatively and urgently to what seems to be a growing sense of threat, really. We want to, in this session, look at some of the many creative responses that are already being made here and around, well, mainly with examples from Birmingham, of course. We want to have a look at and share as many stories, your experiences, and the experiences of our speakers, whom I'll introduce in just a minute. Could I just, because I know that many of you are wanting to link up with your work on Eco Church in terms of responding to crisis, could we have a look, Dan, at just the buildings section of Eco Church, just for a moment, just so people can fix on this. It's optional, of course, you don't have to engage with Eco Church to work on these things, but if you are thinking about Eco Church, tonight is very much around the buildings concerns. And if you have a little look here at just look at questions 1 and 2. We obviously won't go through it, but if you look at question 1 here in the building section, we have measured our energy use and calculated the carbon footprint of our church premises. And as usual with Eco Church, there's a yes response, a no response, or a need to find out response. And I think a couple of years ago, this would have drawn many blank gazes. But in a few minutes, Ben Smith from the Diocese will talk about the energy footprint tool, amongst other things, and how we're all being really encouraged now to drill down and look at what our particular church, our particular set of church buildings, including halls, because we mustn't forget we're not just talking about places of worship here, we're talking about the many buildings associated with our premises. So we're looking at carbon footprint, and look at number 2. We have set sufficient targets for reducing the carbon footprint of our church premises, achieving year-on-year improvements. This is a steady, it's an urgent program we need to look at, but this question 2 reminds us that this is a steady process. It can't all be done with extreme urgency. So these are very useful, as always with Eco Church. Thanks, Dan. We'll sit back. Thank you. As always with Eco Church, it invites us to look steadily and systematically and urgently, yes, but not in a panicky way, about what we need to crack on with. So I hope that's going to be helpful. The main thing is we're here together. We're not alone in this enterprise. More and more churches are joining together, and we realise that there's many ways in this. This is not a fits all approach. And we hope that comes through tonight. So I want to introduce Ben Smith, whom many of you may already know. Ben is the Care of Churches officer at the diocese and also the Environment Programme Manager for the diocese. So Ben, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Marilyn. Dan, would it be possible to share the slides? Thank you. Yes, just to repeat, my name is Ben Smith. I'm Care of Churches Officer on the property team for the Church of England, Birmingham. So means I've got multiple roles, but for the purposes of today, I'm the Environment Programme Manager for the Diocese. Yeah, and so today I'm here to talk about, just briefly really, about the Church of England Birmingham's response to net zero carbon, and also some of the key things that churches can be looking to do. Next slide, please, Dan. Thank you. So first of all, to give a bit of background, as I'm sure many of you are aware already, in February 2020, the Church of England's General Synod agreed a motion for all parts of the Church to work to achieve year-on-year reductions in carbon emissions, with the aim of becoming net zero carbon by 2030. The General Synod recognised the global climate emergency as a crisis for God's creation and a fundamental injustice. So you might be thinking, well, yes, but there are lots of other pressures demanding our attention. Financial pressures, dealing with staff shortages, safeguarding. So why the focus on net zero carbon? So there's four key reasons for this. Firstly, climate justice. Climate change impacts the poorest countries and poorest people the most. Climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. We're part of the problem, however small, so we need to be part of the solution. Number two, intergenerational justice and being relevant with young people. What are we saying to them if we aren't taking action ourselves? Three, credibility. Many people in the church are calling for government and big corporations to do more faster. They're pushing for divestment of funds. And if we want to be credible in those discussions, we need to be taking action ourselves. And also we need to be credible when we're asking our people in our local communities to do more. And fourth, because of the impact that climate change will have on our buildings and our communities if we don't act. We can also look at the flip side, taking a positive view of what our church and our world could look like when we do get to net zero carbon, where we have more justice, more young people engaged, cheap renewable electricity from our roofs, and greater protection from storms. Next slide, please, Dan. So moving on to the net zero carbon project for the Church of England, Birmingham. We have these are a list of all the different buildings that we do have in scope of the target, which we need to be looking at. Next slide, please. And this chart just gives an indication of the sort of proportion of emissions by different building types within the diocese. So you can see from this that churches and church halls, which we're talking about specifically today, make up 36% of the overall carbon emissions for the Church of England, Birmingham, by the latest calculations. Next slide, please. And move on one more, please, actually. Thank you. So the Church of England, Birmingham is basically working towards the Church of England's route map to net zero carbon, which is the detailed plan to achieve net zero carbon by 2030, and is a series of different milestones and actions for all parts of the church to work towards. The focus of the next few years will really be on gathering improved data on our current energy usage, detailed planning towards net zero carbon, communicating the importance of this issue, and starting to look at those more simple, quick wins, if you like, easier ways to reduce energy as a starting point before we look at the larger projects in future years. Next slide, please. And Marilyn mentioned the energy footprint tool earlier. This is the best way that we have to gather data on our current energy usage for church buildings and church halls. And it's the way of finding out your carbon footprint of your church based on the energy used to heat and light the building. Last year, we had 62% of our churches actually submit returns to the energy footprint tool, which was a fantastic figure, actually one of the best in the country. But this year, we're aiming for, if we can, to try and get all churches or almost all churches to submit returns. Next slide, please. And why use it? Particularly for churches, I think the key thing is that it allows you to understand where you're starting from. It gives you that useful figure of an actual carbon footprint figure, which you can then be using in future years as a comparison, as a marker. The fact that these are annual returns means that you can actually start to see the year-on-year progress as hopefully your emissions begin to reduce, and you can see the difference that actions you're taking are making to your overall carbon emissions. In terms of the bigger picture, it's also helpful for both our teams in the diocese and centrally for the Church of England to see that bigger picture. So, for instance, we know from looking at the returns from last year that in the Church of England, Birmingham, about 20% of those churches which submitted actually had very low carbon footprints, less than 2 COE tons over the course of a year. But then we had 10% of those churches had over 40 tons of carbon emissions per year. So it really does vary, and that's where this tool is so useful. Next slide, please. To use the tool, churches need to use the online parish return system. And the key information which you need is your utility bills from the previous year. The tool is open until the end of July for this year's returns. About a quarter of churches in Church of England have already submitted returns, so thank you very much to anybody that's already done it. But I'd really urge anybody that hasn't already done so, or any church that hasn't already done so, to start looking into this now, because I know that otherwise that time just can drip away very quickly. Next slide, please. This is just one example of a church which recently submitted their return for this year. So from this, I'm afraid it's quite small. You might not be able to see it very well, but this church, you can see they had a calculation of their carbon footprint, their gross carbon footprint of 20.3 CO2 tons over the last year. But actually, in this case, because the church was on a renewable electricity tariff, their net carbon figure was only 12.5 CO2 tons. So you can see the difference that one change has made in this case, in terms of reducing that church's carbon footprint. Next slide, please. So once you've submitted an energy footprint tool, what next? Here's some suggestions of things you can start looking at as you begin to plan what you might be able to do with your church building. First of all, the practical path to net zero carbon document, which I'm about to go into in more detail. There's also the Church of England's practical suggestions to help parishes save energy and money. I'll be sharing links after this session with details so you can access these documents. And lastly, many of you will hopefully be aware already of the Church of England's excellent net zero carbon webinar programme, where there's detailed webinars on almost any topic you can think of in relation to net zero carbon, and is a really, really useful tool for any churches seriously thinking about what they might want to do next. Next slide, please. So yes, and then lastly, practical path to net zero carbon. This is a really useful tool, which I'd encourage all churches to look at. Is basically connecting the checklist as a way of looking at possible actions that your church can take to reduce carbon emissions. The document starts with those hopefully more simple, quick wins that are relevant for all churches, but then it moves up as you go through the document to bigger, more complicated, more expensive projects, which might only be suitable for certain churches in certain circumstances. Next slide, please. And this is just a very quick breakdown of the way the document is set out, starting with those low energy users, where the church maybe used once a week, up to those churches used several times per week, and then those very high energy users where churches in daily use. And lastly, things to think about only in certain circumstances. Next slide, please. So yes, first of all, the first section on where do we start. So this is things that are relevant for all churches, but particularly those churches which might already have quite low carbon footprints, which aren't in use regularly during the week. These tend to be smaller steps, which will hopefully be a bit more simple to carry out, but do make a big difference. So just by carrying out these sorts of works, it's been calculated that you could save 50% of your emissions potentially as a church. So this covers things like just good building maintenance, simple draft proofing measures, switching to renewable electricity tariffs, things like that, which all churches should really be able to look at. And I think just to stress here, I forgot to mention earlier that there really is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to reducing carbon emissions for church buildings. It is very much on a case-by-case basis, and for some churches, these steps are all that's going to be needed. I can move on, next slide, please. Moving on to slightly more complicated works, which may be for a church that's in use several times per week. So this is looking at things like simple installation of insulation, maybe zoning heating, or partitioning the building in some way to help with that. Things like installation of electric pew heaters. Next slide, please. And this is just one example of a grade 1 listed church in our diocese, St Lawrence Northfield, which in recent years managed to construct this inner porch as a way of saving energy for this building. So just a good example of what can be done even in a very historic building, which I think is something that's been very successful overall. Next slide, please. And then moving on to now we're looking at more complex projects for those higher energy users, which are maybe in use throughout the week. So in this case, it's larger insulation projects, maybe looking at installation of secondary glazing in certain windows, new lighting systems perhaps, and maybe solar panels in some cases too. And then next slide, please. And then and lastly, it's the document looks at those things which might be relevant only in certain circumstances. So for instance, if your church is doing a re-roofing project anyway, is there potential to insulate that roof better, or install solar panels? If your church is in use throughout the week, could it consider the use of heat pumps or potentially underfloor heating? So things like that, really. And next slide, please. So that was a very brief rundown, but hopefully it's given you something to think about at least. My contact details are there if anybody wants to get in touch with me outside of this session. Always very happy to try and help and answer any questions on this issue. And thanks for your time. I'm happy to take any questions now. Marlene, just on mute.
You're still on mute, Marilyn.
You're still on mute, Marilyn. So.
Right, I'll say it all again. Right, okay. Okay, thanks, Ben. Right, so I'm trying to see if anybody's got their hand up. There's no questions in the chat at the moment. Please do put questions or comments in the chat very freely. Please put your hand up or wave at me if you want to say something. I'm trying to see, or you may just need to unmute yourselves and shout out. That's probably Caroline.
I was just gonna, not a question but a comment about the energy footprint tool, because this year was the first time that we have been able to do it, because we're a new build church, and last year was the first year that we've got 12 months worth of energy usage details, and because at the time that we started out, the really green suppliers were not taking on new customers, we were stuck with our developers, energy providers who are EDF. So when I came to fill out the energy footprint tool at the beginning of this year, you are asked which your energy provider is, and EDF, they say all their business customers are either renewable or nuclear, and we opted for renewable. So I put our details in, and it showed our gross footprint as 20 point something tons, and our net footprint at 19 point something tons, presumably indicative that EDF really does not invest meaningfully in green technologies. But as a matter of interest, I typed in, because you can substitute it on the form, I typed in what it would have been if we'd gone with Ecotricity, which is the one that we tried to go with, and that immediately would have shrunk our carbon footprint to 2.8 tons. So when it becomes possible to go with the really green providers, it really makes a huge difference if a church is in a position to go for that.
Yes, thanks, Caroline. Yes, it's really important to spread the message, isn't it, about tariffs, who you are buying your electricity from. Ben, have you got anything to come back with on that?
Not really. I think it's obviously a tricky time for a lot of churches to look at potentially switching tariffs, and so it's something which only if it does appear to be the right time for your church to really look at that. But there is obviously an issue with the different tariffs and companies that are available. And I would just encourage churches, I think maybe with when I do share the various links and documents by email after this session, maybe I can also share the Church of England's list of those suppliers which it considers to be renewable, just so that people do have that information to hand.
Thank you. That will be very useful. And of course, also the cost of renewable energy is falling all the time relative to fossil fuels, isn't it? So this is a fast moving scene, actually. Right. Anybody else? I'm just looking in the chat. Oh, Hilary, are you coming in there?
Yes. So our church, actually we have 3 churches in our benefice, but one of them is a community center during the week, and twice a month we have worship services on Sunday. So my question is, how do we parse out, how do we do, I mean, I don't know if other churches are in this same situation where the building's used by someone, maybe even most of the time, but it's still a church. Do you have any suggestions?
So so I'm not familiar with your particular case. Is the church building owned by the church, or is it shared use? Is it?
It's shared use. It is now I don't know as much of the details as I will in a little bit, but it's run by a trust. So it is still consecrated church, and it's run by a trust. So I'm not sure if it's owned by the trust or not.
We might need to have a discussion about this maybe outside of this meeting once I can get a bit more detail. But I did forget to say in the presentation that anybody that does have questions about completing the energy footprint tool, please do contact me. But that sounds like quite a specific case where maybe we just need to to do a little bit more digging to understand the best way of approaching it. But there is some, it's not a straightforward matter for all churches, certainly. That there are various churches where it is a bit more complicated trying to get a simple figure for this.
I hear this so much, Hilary. I hear that kind of story so much, that people come to the energy tool with their bills, but that is by no means the end of the story. It's much more complicated than that. And Ben, so you're at the end of the phone, Ben, then to help people out on that. That's fantastic. Fred, you've got a question in the chat. Do you want to ask that yourself, or do you want me to read it out? Fred Collin?
Yeah, Ben, I'll just, on the submission of the utility bills to the diocese, does the tool automatically work out what the carbon footprint would be, or
yes, basically. So the information you need to put in is either the kilowatt hours over the year for that energy, or the price that you paid for that energy, and then the tool does the calculations to actually generate that carbon footprint figure based on that information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Gillian.
When it comes to the energy companies, I have a feeling that in Backer, some months back, we had this discussion that when you have this parish buying collectively, what's recommended, some of the places that where the Diocese or the Church of England was had these contracts were not the most eco ones, and I wonder if that has changed. Am I right, Marilyn?
I'm not sure. Ben, what do you know
Yeah.
about the buying basket?
It's not something to be honest, it's not something I can really, I don't know enough about it. I know there has been some debate about this in the past, and I don't know the current situation.
Yeah, it used to be with.
Yeah.
Does anybody in the room know the answer to this one?
I do know that at our church we brought this up. It may be close to late last spring, and because we were buying it with the whole diocesan collectively, the powers that be were reluctant to change because it'd be much more expensive to buy individually than through the cooperative. So I feel if that's the case, still, diocese needs to look into this and do its negotiating with the eco companies that they want to recommend. So, does that make sense?
Yes, Peter and Sue Peter and Sue, do you want to come in on that one? You've got something to say about this?
Yes, we've used parish buying for our gas and electricity for some years. I mean, it takes all the work out of having to look around lots of different companies to get different quotes. And they do say that they give us a good deal because of being a basket, and also the electricity is renewable.
Right.
I think that there is some controversy, because I think one of the main providers through parish buying is Total Energies.
Yes.
Right,
And
that's right. Yes.
there is a fair amount of evidence that their policies in terms of prospecting for new oil and gas and the like are not really consistent with net zero. And I think that is something that must be being addressed at the parish buying and perhaps at the higher Church of England level, because it's still quite a controversy. It's certainly not that we can say clearly, oh yeah, if you're going with parish buying through the basket, then it's fine, it's really good renewable energy.
Okay, there's some interesting things coming through on the chat. Thank you, Laurie and Lynn. I think we actually may need to move on to the next section of this meeting. I very much encourage Laurie and Lynn to stay on just for a few minutes, if you possibly can, just at the end for the extended discussion. Lynn, you have a very technical question there, which people might find very interesting. But it is 8 o'clock. Thanks, Ben, very much for that very useful session. Want to move on now to hear about examples of what's happening around in the diocese. And Heather Holmes, you're going to lead us on this. You are a Deanery Environmental Champion, aren't you, for the Kings Heath, Moseley, Shirley and Kings Norton Deanery. So Heather, over to you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Ben, for your your presentation. Dan, can you share my slide? Is that okay? Thanks.
Yeah.
So yes, we, as a Deanery Environmental Champion, along with Caroline Egan and some of the other people, I see Jean Soper's on the call and Lynn, our fellow Deanery Environmental Champions. We want to encourage you and support you in both Eco Church and
in terms of net zero. In terms of Deanery Environmental Champions, Julia, Howell, myself and Rachel and Caroline have been in post for about 2 years. And more recently, the other deaneries have come on board. And Chris Milton's here on the call as well. And Eve Pitt are also Deanery Environmental Champions. So please, in terms of your particular deaneries, keep in touch with your Deanery Environmental Champions. And as parish environmental contacts, many of you, I notice the names, are parish environmental contacts for your parishes. And so the idea is that now that we've got a network of Deanery Environmental Champions across all the deaneries, those champions will keep in touch with the parish environmental contacts in their deaneries and keep you informed of what's going on. So we're beginning to meet every 8 weeks. We've met a number of times and we're beginning to share information across the deaneries. And so, you know, sharing things that work, sharing documents that are helpful, so that there's that cross-fertilization of ideas. So in terms of support, there's the Deanery Environmental Champions all in place now and are building up skills. Most parishes have got parish environmental contacts in place. And if your parish hasn't got a parish environmental contact in place, please volunteer to be that contact. And so that you can pass information to your PCC and back again. Again, no question is, you know, if you've got a question, issues you're struggling with, then a good point to call to start off with is your Deanery Environmental Champion. And if they don't know, then again, we can ask people in our network, such as Ben, or in the national team. So yeah, on to the next section is the property team. So thank you, Ben, for coming along. So Ben's part of the Birmingham Diocese property team. It's headed up by Dan Mays, who's the head of the property team. And the other people you might know are people like Ian Simpson, part of that team. It's a relatively small team in Birmingham, but members of BACA supporting the team in any way we can. And the idea is that by having the Deanery Environmental Champions and the parish environmental contacts, that we can actually get information from the property team out to the parishes, and questions and difficulties back from the parishes back to the property team, and try and work through together solutions. And then lastly, as Ben mentioned, the National Environmental Programme, who've been developing the route map, also have been developing these webinars. So at the moment, there are 72 available. And as Ben says, that, you know, all sorts of issues are covered. Next slide, Dan, please. Yeah, so you'll see it's very small writing, but one is becoming a net zero carbon church, becoming a net zero carbon school, having a net zero carbon action plan. So all those webinars are there and available. Again, if you can't find what you're looking for, ask. Recently, somebody asked me a question. I got in touch with the environmental team nationally, and Catherine Ross and Joe Chamberlain in the national team are happy to help again. So please do ask. And then if we can have the next slide, please, Dan. And then what we decided to do was look at 3 different ways churches in Kings Norton, Moseley and Shirley Deanery have been looking at tackling the route to net zero. So Mike Powell sends his apologies, he's not able to be here at the moment, but he's written an article which is on the Diocese website. He's from Barnt Green and Cofton Hackett. And what he's been looking at is over the last 10 years, Mike and his green group at church have been looking at monthly at their meter readings, keeping a record, understanding their usage trends, seeing what's going on before they make any changes, and then as they make changes, seeing the impact of those changes. So, for example, they've tracked the change in their energy usage when they installed a new boiler, put their new boiler controls in and installed their LED lighting. And Mike was saying that by tracking their monthly energy usage, it's also an early warning system in case anything's going wrong, like inadvertently the heating controls have gone skew-whiff, or there's been a heating failure, or the hot taps are leaking, etc. So it's a good way of both seeing what's going on, seeing if there's any problems and difficulties, and analysing what happens when you make changes. And lastly, we learnt on the recent carbon literacy course that where people do track their energy usage and they make a note of it and they make it visible in the building, that actually the impact of simply doing that can reduce your energy usage by up to 10% on average, which, you know, again, is worthwhile doing, isn't it? And lastly, as part of Eco Church, one of the things that they encourage, and I think Marilyn drew our attention to this about the energy usage, they recommend developing an energy reduction plan. So again, with these times of very high fuel costs, I think that's a good thing to be doing. Next slide, please. So we're pleased to have Kate on the call today, and she's kindly given us details of what she's been doing in the Shirley Parish Church Hall, where they've done renovations. She's managed to raise 25,450 through Veolia, 10,000 through the lottery fund. And with that, she's replaced an old boiler with ceiling hung electric infrared radiant heating panels, programmable heating zones. I know Ben was mentioning about zoning areas, and obviously Kate's been doing that in their church hall to only heat the areas that one's using. They've upgraded their circuitry, putting a modern distribution board, again putting LED lighting in, emergency lighting, timers in the toilets, insulating the loft and cold east wall, and making good the decoration. So Kate's kindly given her email address. And next slide, please, and we'll, yeah. So Kate's given us a bit of detail about the Veolia grant. It's via the Landfill Communities Fund, which is a government scheme for companies operating landfill sites, where we get 90%, they get 90% relief on landfill tax by donating money to community projects. The recipient needs to provide the remaining 10%. The project site has to be within a certain distance from the landfill area to qualify, and that can be checked prior to applying. And the aim is to create significant environmental and public benefits by supporting projects which either improve the life of communities or aid nature conservation. And Kate was saying she got a grant of 25,450, but actually you can get larger amounts. And also she applied for the 10 grand for the lotteries fund, which again, she said was a very easy form. So in terms of these photos, the first one shows the hall before the insulation, where it's completing it between the rafters and the painting. You can see the infrared panels. Sorry, the first photo, the east wall is being lined with insulation and boarded over, and you can see the spaces between the rafters below the ceiling, which also lose a lot of heat. And then after insulation, the second photo shows where it's completed between the rafters and the painting's all finished. You can see the infrared panels suspended from the middle of the ceiling. And then on the side are acoustic panels. And just a bit of a tip from Kate, she had quotes from large developers and also from small local firms. And what she learned was the large firms want to quote for the whole project and weren't really interested in working, say, just on the electrics. And of course, they charge VAT. And so that increases costs by 20%. But she was greatly helped by 2 small local firms who saved her a lot of money and took a personal interest in the project. So she thinks it's worth considering small firms in any tendering process. So that's kind of the other side of, you know, getting your church net zero, is the carbon footprint of your church hall. And lastly, oh, sorry, Dan, can you show us?
Yeah.
Drum roll. We've got our net zero church with St Michael's, Baddesley, Clinton, which is a grade 2 listed building, and also is in Kings Norton, Moseley and Shirley Deanery, where they're heating the people and not the space. There are electric pew heaters, and I'd encourage you that if you're passing by, that's a very beautiful church to go and visit, and you can actually see the pew heaters. And a few of us went on a trip and experienced how warm it was to be heated up, you know, through the pew rather than the whole space to be heated. They've also changed to LED lighting and switched to a green electricity provider. So, you know, that's one of our first examples of net zero. Thank you. And if anybody, Kate's on the call, so if anybody's got some detailed questions to Kate around the, you know, the work that she did on her church hall, I'm sure she'd be very happy to answer them.
Yes, thanks very much, Heather. Yes, I think thank you, Dan. Yes, and because St Michael's, Baddesley, Clinton is so close to us, it's really worth a visit. You know, I think churches need to visit one another more and more, don't we? Because it's such an opportunity to go and actually see it in action, the way, you know, you can heat people, not space. It's a brilliant example, and the detail of it is actually on the Church of England national site. You can see a video about it. So yes, a few minutes then to respond and ask questions to Heather or Kate and Guy.
Thank you. So the Landfill Community Fund, I just had a look at the website, and the next round of funding opens on 25th of May. I'm just wondering how detailed the plans needed to be for the work before you made the application, and what kind of, you know, how much of work it was to put the application together for that.
The first thing to do is to check that you are within the requisite 15 miles of.
Yeah, we are.
Okay, so
yeah,
you can check that on the website.
Yeah.
It is quite a detailed form, because our grant of 25k was fairly modest by their standards, so they do require quite a bit. Although the amount of text you can put in is limited, so you know you don't have to write pages and pages. They like lots of photos. I had to actually make a video walkthrough, which is the first time I've ever made a video, and I can tell you it doesn't have to be a brilliant video. I don't know whether they looked at it even, but it wasn't a wonderful. You know, it wasn't slick in any way. I told them what they needed to know. I actually delayed my application by 6 months and went into the next application cycle because I felt I hadn't got quite enough done. Okay. But it's very clear, they're very supportive. If you've got any questions at all, they are definitely on your side.
And when you put together your bid, do you have to itemize the expenditure and have more than one quote?
What I did, and I think I could have done it a lot better. I costed all the elements rather too approximately. I think it is worth getting more detailed quotes, and at least getting 2 quotes. and then what you do is you put in a bid for all the elements of your project. And again, I think I had the idea, oh well, maybe if I didn't ask for too much, I'd be more likely. But I think if they like your project, you'll get it. They are particularly interested in how much the general community has access to your building. This is why it's much more suitable for churches, for church halls than churches, unless your church is a community centre. It's a big community thing, and I had to do a sort of community survey of people using the building, and all sorts of a monkey survey of people who are already using the building. But it's not that difficult. I've done more difficult application forms, and they are particularly interested, I think, in things that have an impact on your carbon footprint and have got environmental implications. If you look at all the projects they're giving money to now, they are stressing the environmental impact.
And I see that stressing biodiversity as well. So if you had a sort of gardening project,
yes, they do a lot of that sort of thing.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Kate. That's very, very helpful. Any other questions? Anybody got their hand up who I am not seeing? Sheena. Sheena, do you want to come in? Can you unmute, Sheena, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Marilyn. It's not a question. It's just to emphasize what Heather said about keeping records, because we found that was one of the most important things in achieving our Eco Church Awards. They really wanted detailed records, and they wanted you to show progression from where you'd been to where you were now at Eco Church. And so it's worth starting as you mean to go on, I think, because you can't always find the information later on. So start off by keeping good records for your Eco Church work.
Yes, indeed, that's very good general advice. And there is a question, which I think I'm going to actually lurch back at you, Ben, on. There's a general sort of question which applies to a lot of this. In 1 minute, can you tell us the answer to, is there any money from the diocese to help with any of this? I know that's a
no. It's the short answer. No, there are no diocesan grant funds for any project. I'm hopeful that in future years there will be national funding available from the Church of England, but there's nothing been confirmed yet for works towards net zero carbon. So that's where I would encourage churches to focus now on planning and focus on the things that you feel might be needed in future years, so that hopefully when grant funds do may become available within the next few years, that you're in a good position to then go for it. So that would be the message from me, is nothing at the moment, but who knows in future. And so focus on just focus on what you think is going to be needed going forward. Yes, don't be put off by the initial kind of no on that one. Thanks, Ben. Thanks so much, Heather. Really helpful session. Heather, do you want to come back with anything just before we move on?
No. Would you like me to introduce Sheena now?
Yes, I would love that. Yes.
Thank you, Marilyn. So we need a little drum roll for Sheena, introduction for Sheena, because Sheena is part of St Peter's Maney, who've got Eco Church Gold. Right. And so we welcome you, Sheena, and you're going to tell us about LED lighting. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. As you know now, that I'm a member of St Peter's Church in Maney in Sutton Coldfield, and I wasn't actually meant to do this, so I hope you'll bear with me. But my colleague who was going to do it has been ill, unfortunately, and though he's making good recovery, he's not able to be with us this evening. Anyway, I'll just try and share my screen with you. Okay. Oh dear, that seems to be, it doesn't really matter. It's only the title screen anyway. So Our first step at St. Peter's on our eco-church journey was to install solar panels, but our second was to change about 100 of the light bulbs in the church to LEDs. Over the years, we've extended the coverage of LEDs to include the halls, the office, all communal areas, and all outside lighting. Only the chancel remains to be done, but the fittings there are unsuitable, so replacement of these is planned shortly. As a result of changing to LEDs, we've been able to reduce our electricity consumption by approximately 20%, with the added benefit of having brighter bulbs. The previous bulbs were 60 watts, while the LEDs are 100-watt equivalent. Now, I'm not an electrician, and I left at GCSE level, so I hope any technical people listening will bear with me if I try to set out the difference between LEDs and other bulbs. The old style bulbs that we grew up with are incandescent bulbs. They operate by converting electricity into... Is anybody else getting this thing about my connection being unstable? Good, hope not. Sorry, just flashed up on my screen. Yes, the old style bulbs were incandescent bulbs, and they operate by converting electricity into heat before they can produce light. In contrast, LEDs convert 95% of the energy they use into light and only 5% into heat. The curly bulbs that some of us may still have in our house are called CFLs, or compact fluorescent lamps, and they were the early form of energy-saving bulbs. LEDs use 60% less energy than CFLs. Moreover, CFLs contain mercury and other chemicals, which mean they need special recycling provisions. Halogen bulbs also convert electricity into heat. Do you remember how hot those lamps and things were with the early halogen bulbs? You could very easily burn yourself on them. Both halogen and fluorescent bulbs are now being phased out, and some, the halogen ones, from as early as September this year. I found this chart useful when I was preparing this presentation, because I think a lot of people are confused by the range of bulbs available. Old bulbs were measured in watts, which is a measurement of the amount of electricity used. LEDs are measured in lumens, which measures the amount of light produced. This chart shows you how many lumens you need excuse me, to achieve the same amount of light as a 25, 40, 60, 75 or 100 watt bulb. There are also other variables as to the style of the bulb, the type of fitting, you know, whether it's a bayonet or an Edison screw or so forth, and also the color of the light. The color of the light is measured in kelvins, or K. The higher the Kelvin rating, the whiter and brighter the light is. So 6000 K equates to bright daylight at noon. So that's a light quality which is good for close working, like needlework or reading. But lower K levels are better for relaxing. So I hope that gives you some idea. I know when you go into a supplier and look at the bulbs, it's absolutely mind-blowing, all the different sorts that there are. But I've found looking at this chart has sort of helped me to have a better idea of what I might be looking for in the future. And obviously in churches, you'll be going for a fairly bright light and something in the range of 60 to 100 watts, I suppose, equivalents. There is absolutely no doubt that installing LEDs will reduce your electricity usage. Also, the LEDs last much longer than other bulbs. A 100-watt incandescent bulb lasts approximately, is there any way, Dan, do you know, is there any way I can get rid of the, I'm having trouble seeing all of my,
you want to use the back. Have you got a back pointer on your?
What, say?
Have you got some arrow keys? I don't know. You might have to start your slideshow from the beginning again, I think.
Yeah, right.
Oh, no, you got reverse a few times. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I get. No, it's just going. Sorry, I can't see all the figures. I'm sorry, but when you get the slides to you, it will show you. But an LED lasts approximately 5 times as long as a fluorescent lamp, and very much more than an old incandescent bulb. And as a result, LEDs need replacing far less frequently. Less frequent replacement means less maintenance and a reduction in manufacturing, transportation costs, and the use of raw materials, which therefore results in a reduced carbon footprint. Fewer replacements are also good for health and safety, especially in churches with high ceilings or where scaffolding may be needed. My late husband used to be involved in changing the bulbs at St. Peter's, and I was always worried sick when he went off to do that, because the height of the ladders was so high that I was terrified something awful would happen. So the fewer times you have to replace a bulb, the better. There are, of course, some drawbacks. There always are. LEDs are more expensive than what we've been used to, and not all fittings, especially in heritage buildings, are suitable. Changing fittings may involve a lot of work and expense, including scaffolding or rewiring. And some churches might find the cost of changing to LEDs difficult. What we did at St. Peter's was we asked members of the congregation to pay for the bulbs. We had a chart, a bit like a bingo card, where people were asked to fill out the number of squares they would like to pay for. The bulbs were much more expensive in those days. I think they were about £10 each, but they are much cheaper these days. You could also ask church groups or the uniformed organisations if they would raise funds for one or more bulbs. And you could use the exercise as a way of raising awareness about energy saving, both with the congregation and the wider community.
Tina, I'm going to be very rude and jump in here because we are actually out of time.
I'm just about finished.
Okay, fine. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we set about it? The most important thing is to plan it well. Read up out on the Church of England website. I've given you the link there. Consider the age of your fittings, because it might be more cost effective to replace the fittings when you're actually doing the bulbs as well, especially if the fittings are near their end of their useful life. Some further information that might be useful. It's relatively easy to replace existing fluorescent lighting with LEDs, and you can also replace your outside lights and floodlights. If you are making changes, do consider installing sensors in the toilets and kitchens and hallways, etc., to make further savings, or at the very least put up notices reminding people to switch off lights. Buy good quality bulbs for the longest life, and make sure that you use them in those difficult to reach areas. You can find bulb suppliers on the internet, so research the different bulb suppliers and buy all the bulbs of the same sort. It's a more sensible thing to do if you can afford it. And buy a named brand like Philips or Osram. It's a high initial cost, but you need to remember that you will soon recover your investment. And I've given you some useful websites there, and the name of a good bulb supplier that I have used in the past. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Sheena. Yeah, That's extremely useful, Gina. I'm sorry to rush you.
It's okay.
Okay, I'm not going to take questions on that, but I do encourage people to stay on because I know there were loads of questions earlier sessions about lead lighting. John Nightingale, can you come in now, please? Because I think you're just going to finish this hour session for us, aren't you? Thanks so much, Sheena. Thanks, John.
Yes, indeed. One of the things that I do is help Patrick, the environmental officer, with prayers. And we have a Diocesan prayer diary, and we have some items every month on the environment. What we'd really like is something rather specific, things to be thankful for that parishes have been able to do, things to pray for where there are challenges that need to be faced. And I'd like to finish by using a prayer which Pope Francis closes his encyclical Laudato Si with. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor of the earth are crying out. O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much, John. And to everyone who's come, please, I'm not going to beat about the bush. Please feel free to go, of course. And please also do stay if you want to continue these discussions, particularly about the lead lighting, maybe if we didn't have a chance to discuss that, but about tonight. Thanks again so much. And I think we just go straight on, really. And we'll let people leave, of course. And thanks for all the comments coming through on the chat. But of the people staying, please launch straight in with questions and comments. I don't know if we still have, do we still have Laurie with us? Laurie, you had a very good observation about the whole thing about electricity tariffs, didn't you?
Hi, yes.
Just say something about that, Laurie. That was such a. Sorry, I didn't have to bring it out of the chat during the time. Yeah.
I'm just going to share a link to the Centre for Sustainable Energy, the charity in Bristol, and they explain it quite well. Basically, it's just a problem with the way that the government labels renewable tariffs. There was a consultation that was going to fix it a couple of years ago, but seems to have gone quiet. But yeah, basically, companies that generate electricity are not necessarily the ones that then sell you the electricity. And the way that trading goes on means that the certificates of renewable generation can actually be handed over to different companies. And so it's quite difficult to actually keep track of companies that are responsible for building wind turbines or putting up solar panels, and then also selling that to you. And so there are a couple of companies that have a very good reputation for this, and they go to great lengths to prove that they have green electricity. It's very easy to get caught out by it, because everyone wants you to buy a green electricity tariff. So I mean, it's obviously a good thing because it's signaling intent regardless, but to actually get the renewable, the sort of the meaningful benefit from it is really difficult to find out.
I think that's an important nuance that you've just outlined there, Laurie. Thanks for that. And as you say, it is good that the big providers are shifting, but it's very slow. And if you want to be really saving, you need to go with one of the Good Energy, Ecotricity, I suppose, or even perhaps at Octopus. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Laurie, very much for that. I don't know if Lynn is still with us. Lynn, you had a very technical question, didn't you?
Okay, it didn't seem very technical, but basically we've got a mobile phone mast in our tower that's been there for some years, and we get billed for the electricity that uses by our electricity company, and the mast company have got some sort of meter in there that they use to work out how much they owe us, basically, and then they reimburse us. And I just wondered whether we're supposed to be including that energy, it's not energy that we're using specifically, in our energy footprint tool, or whether we should be excluding that in some way.
It's a complicated one, I guess, Ben.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one I've not come across before, so I think I'm actually going to have to ask the national teams on this one.
Sorry, Ben, I didn't catch what you said.
So I said, so I think it's not a question I've come across before. I think I'm going to have to ask the national teams to get their view on it. But what I would say is, I think I tend to see this energy footprint tool as it's a tool for you, it's a tool for the churches. So if it's going to be difficult to try and take that figure out of the overall figure, then I wouldn't worry about it. And the main thing is that for your church to see that comparison year on year for how you're doing. But it sounds as though if you could take that out, it might be best. But I think it's probably best for me to just get a national viewpoint on that for people who are a bit more familiar with it.
Right. So you're saying you're going to get a national viewpoint on it?
Yeah, I'll speak to the administrators of the tool.
And you'll come back to
and I'll come back to you. Yeah.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Yes, illustrating once again that we are not alone with these tricky problems. Angela,
Marilyn, have you seen Angela?
Yes, I've just seen that. Yes, Angela.
Right. Yeah. Just to give you a bit of insight, at my previous church, my husband changed all the lighting to LEDs. We had solar panels fitted, and we also had air source heat pumps. And what they are, they're the opposite of what happens with your fridge. The air is pulled in and heated up, and it heats the air. Because there was a high ceiling, we had fans put in, which would then draw the heat down. And I can't remember what the percentage was, but I think it was about 60–70% is how much we reduced our electricity by, just by changing all the lighting in the main sanctuary and the hall to LEDs, and having the air source heat pumps. Even with the fans, it brought it down because it was keeping the heat, the fans were keeping the heat down. So when we started the service, we switched the fans off. But then when it was warm and it was too hot inside, we used the air source heat pump to pump the cold air in.
And of course you had the solar panels helping you to helping the air source heat pumps run, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
And at home we've got solar panels on the house. And if it wasn't, we're all electric at home. If it wasn't for the solar panels, I wouldn't have been able to afford on 2 retirees, on 2 pensions, to heat my house. So I am really, really thankful that, yes, solar panels are initially expensive, but what you get back is unbelievable.
Interesting. Very.
Angela, is you on the feed-in tariff? Or are you on
No, when we had the solar panels, they'd stop the FIT payments. We had the FIT payments at the church.
Yeah.
And that payment actually put what we were using into some form of credit. But what we've got at home, we have the batteries. So we're constantly backing it up with the batteries.
No. So you've got it to fall back on?
Yes, yeah. So, you know, if ever the electricity goes, we've got the battery back up.
Okay. So you've not got anything going into the grid? So you're not getting anything back from that? But you've got the...
We're not feeding into it, but then we're not pulling from it.
Yeah, okay, I've got you. But the batteries are expensive to buy, aren't they?
Well, we did the batteries as part of the package with purchasing the solar panels,
Yeah.
and we actually went with a local company. And I can back up what was said earlier. The big companies want to do the whole package. The smaller companies will come in and go for the package that you want.
Yeah.
You can tailor the package to what you want. And we used the same chap to put the solar panels on home as we did at church.
And how long have you had the solar panels?
Solar panels, this was our first winter.
Okay.
So I think we've had our solar panels in now 12 months. The church I was at, it would be 4 years. But
Right.
we have seen, or I have seen, because what we were doing at the old church, we were taking monthly readings so that we could see the difference between the previous winter when we didn't have them and the first winter when we did. And as the years have gone on, you could see the bills coming down.
Okay. And have you got gas at home as well?
No, we've got no gas in the
Your
property
heating
at
is
all.
all electric at home.
All electric, yeah.
Right.
Mm.
Wow.
People, I was asking in the chat, what church are you talking about where all this has been done, Angela?
It was my previous church, which was a Baptist church.
Right.
Can I ask which one?
Grenfell Baptist in Ward End.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, very interesting. I'm glad they've got you on their green team, Angela, as you were saying before.
Well, I sort of got asked if I could go onto it because I've got all this experience with having them at home. And it was like, yeah, go on. But I am an advocate for solar panels. I really am. And so is my father in his 80s. And he said 20 years ago, gas will be out. He said, electricity is the way to go.
Well, he was prophetically right, wasn't he?
He certainly was.
Any comments or further questions? Anything we've done tonight? LEDs and the complications sometimes that people have found with those. Anything on anything really? That I can't see any. I keep scanning this screen, but I can't see anybody with their hand up. But there may be. Shout out if you want to. Gillian.
What was his name? The person who talked. Not Ben, the other young chap. He talked about some charity in Bristol.
Yes, that's on the chat. He's put the.
It's on the chat. So I need to look there. It's just to know what that charity is. I like to look them up. I like to see. Okay, I looked at them in the chat. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Laurie, for doing this. It's on the chat. All that link is there.
Fascinating. It really was excellent. Thank you. And thanks for all the talks. It's been very, very good. Very informative.
Thanks, Jill.
And interesting. Thank you.
Caroline.
Yeah, just Fred was asking earlier about money being available. And one thing that Heather and I heard about yesterday is, I can't remember which church it is in Shirley. Which one is, because they looked at trying to get money from the Landfill Community Fund, but because it was for the church and not for a church hall, they couldn't get it from that. So what they did do was that, because they're going for a heat pump to heat their church, and so they're going for crowdfunding, and Aviva will match crowdfunding raised up to a certain limit.
Really?
So they are asking members of the congregation to pledge, and I think it's something like up to £300 of what is pledged per person will be matched by.
So it was 250, Caroline.
250.
Yeah. So if they did it in package of 250, Aviva would match each 250. So if they've got friends or anything that were willing to give 500, they were asking them to put it in packets of 250.
Well, that's very useful, isn't it? She wants to come in there.
At St. Peter's, we're thinking about having a sort of campaign in the autumn to ask people to think about a legacy towards green works, because sometimes people can't afford anything while, you know, from their income, but when they die, they could leave even a small amount. We hope to build up a green fund to make changes nearer to 2030, because we have fairly new boilers, and you know, it would be bad to get rid of them just out of, you know, fashion, if you like. But
Yes.
we know that we'll have these expenses later on, so we're trying to, as I say, build up a fund that will be available for making more changes when the time comes.
And there are some really
Good
good resources about how you broach the subject of people doing legacies.
I think the diocese has an advisor on legacies. Yeah.
So we could share links if churches wanted to have campaigns in their local churches.
Now, I just feel if people say are leaving a legacy to the church or something like that, even just part of it could be for green matters.
Yes, good idea. Good.
I must admit, that's how Grenfell Baptist got their solar panels.
Yeah.
It was through somebody leaving some funds in their will. And I sort of said, look, come on, this place it's burning money. Let's go for solar panels. Now, just a word of warning with crowdfunding. I don't know if it's true, but if you don't get all the money, from what I can gather, if you don't hit the fund that you're wanting, you don't get that money back. Plus, there's I think some firms, if you raise so much, they will charge you so much per donation, per person who's donated. So it might be an idea to look into that, because I know my husband was looking into it for somebody else. So it might be an idea just to see if there are any
interesting
more print clauses.
Does anybody here in the room have any experience of crowdfunding mechanisms, good or bad? Shout out if you do. I can't see any hands going
We
up.
could link you if people were interested. I'm sure that Jodie, who was the person who was explaining, we could link up with her and check out what the facts are.
Yeah.
I know, sorry, Marilyn, I think Martin had a question. He had his hand up.
Sorry, I didn't see that. Go ahead, please. Yeah. I can't see him. Where is he?
Martin, you're muted.
Oh, Martin, yes.
You're muted.
You're still muted.
Okay.
No, that's it. No, you're still muted. Is your computer muted?
We can't hear you, Martin.
No. Could you perhaps put your question in the chat, because we're not hearing you?
Who's this, Martin?
Will you put it in the chat for us, Martin? I'm looking at the chat now because we can't hear you. We're still putting it in. While Martin does that, is there anybody else who wants to come in with anything? Ben, you want to say something?
Just thought I'd add in talking about grant funding and different types of funding. The diocese doesn't have any grants, but we do have a staff member who can advise on grants. So I'd encourage anybody looking at what grant funding might be available to speak to Ian Simpson, our Historic Place of Worship Support Officer, who will have his finger on the pulse of what grants are out there for building works, including net zero carbon. So it's always a useful resource to speak to.
Yes, that's very useful. Thank you. I'm just writing to Martin here because I still can't see anything. Let's just send that for a minute. Okay. Martin, I think we're still not getting you. Anybody else in these last few minutes that we've got? Anybody else want to come in with any stories or experiences or questions for anybody? Or are we? Or not? I can't see anybody waving their hand at me. I'm so sorry, Martin. I can't see anything on the chat either. Don't think I'm missing anything from you. Yeah, I don't know what happened there, Martin. Sorry. Okay.
Ian Martin could always email me, and I could then forward the question to whoever it was most relevant for, so that we don't lose it.
Yes.
You've got my email address. Yeah,
that's useful. Okay, Martin. I'm sorry we can't hear you. Okay. Okay. All right.
Just
now, yeah.
One little thing. I presume, Dan, that this will be in a website somewhere that I can pass it on to people who I wish were here tonight, because I think it's been an excellent session.
Oh yeah,
I would like to encourage people, so to make sure you send it to everybody that was here, I guess, or have some way that we can.
Yeah, it should appear next week sometime. Yeah.
Okay,
we'll send it around. Yeah.
So you will send it to each participant down, yeah?
As long as we've got everybody's address. I don't know if Heather knows.
Or Heather will have it. Yeah.
I'm happy to.
Yeah, Heather's
yes.
Okay,
Thank you. It's been excellent.
Okay. Well, I think that looks like we are done here now. Thank you so much, particularly to Ben, for being with us, Ben, and giving up your time for such an excellent presentation and helping us out there. And thanks to everybody who's contributed and everybody who's here. And yeah, okay. So good night. Take care.
Good night.
Go well.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye all.
Good night. Thank you.